They had that capsule loaded with all kinds of glue and fabrics. They cranked the oxygen pressure up to somewhere about 20 pounds positive. See, they're on a pure oxygen thing in there. Well, 20 pounds of pure oxygen is going to kill you anyway, just about, if you're under it too long. And, you know, you make explosion-proof switches for any place that may have gases in it. Well, oxygen is a gas, but they didn't use explosion-proof switches in that ship. They murdered him.
To recap on everything we have established, North American Aviation had known of the fire risk as early as 1964 and then falsely claimed that they thought NASA was doing the test at only 5 psi. NASA had compiled a report in 1964 documenting known oxygen fires at Navy and Air Force bases. These fires had illustrated, in concrete fashion, the potential dangers of 100% pure oxygen atmospheres.
Grissom brought it up initially about there being too much Velcro and too much other stuff around.
Grissom was concerned about how much Velcro was in the spacecraft, and North American Aviation never removed it. NASA knew the wiring in the spacecraft was in bad condition and would fire anyone who dared bring it to attention.
And the wires were really bad in there. I'd ask Gus. I said, Gus, why don't you say something about this wiring? I said, this is really terrible. I ought to do something about this wiring. It's really bad. And he said, I don't. And he said, I can't say anything about it or they'll fire me. That's what he told me. Couldn't believe it.
The fire extinguishers were pulled from the spacecraft and the wires were stripped of their Teflon. Various pieces of equipment were untested and uncertified before they were installed inside the capsule. Grissom was so mad that he took out his anger by hanging a lemon on the spacecraft, something that both Jay Windley and Jim Lovell deny. And of course, the hatch they put on the vehicle could only be opened from the outside.
Hey, how are we gonna get to the moon if we can't talk between 3 buildings?
As we just saw, according to the official communications, from the first mention of fire to the point the capsule ruptured, only 15 seconds went by. During his testimony to Congress, Frank Borman stated that in order to save the crew, the hatch would need to open outward in 2 seconds. Earlier, in Gordon Cooper's Leap of Faith, we are told that the new Apollo hatch, which could be opened in 20 seconds, would probably have saved the crew. What good would a hatch that opens in 20 seconds do if they only had 15 seconds to get out? Or did the crew have more time on their side than we were told? During his testimony, Thomas Ronald Barron made a far more damaging revelation. After the fire, Barron had met with a North American Aviation employee by the name of Al Holmberg. Holmberg told Barron the astronauts had reported fire a good 10 to 12 minutes earlier, and that the astronauts had tried to get out for 5 minutes. Congress immediately tried to shoot down Barron's credibility for bringing this to attention. They even went as far as criticizing him for misspelling Deke Sladen's surname. Almost immediately after his testimony, Al Holmberg himself was brought in for questioning, and promptly denied talking to Barron. Here a curious thing happens. As Bill Casing noted, Holmberg's reasons for being there changes throughout his testimony. At first, Holmberg states that he came at his own free will. But then he claims the only reason he turned up was he worked outside and it was time for him to go to work. Then finally, Robert Smart, the assistant to the president of North American Aviation, comes forth and does the talking for him, stating that he sent one of his employees to go and find Mr. Holmberg. Curiously, although denying he told Barron about the early cries of fire, and just before Robert Smart steps in to do the talking for him, Al Holmberg said this when answering to a question regarding his meeting with Barron. "I bumped into him accidentally almost every time I met him. I told him I shouldn't even be talking to him because of the report he is writing, and he is probably being watched." A week after Barron testified, he was found dead along with his wife and stepdaughter when their car was crushed by a train. Even though Florida law insists that the bodies be autopsied, Barron was promptly cremated after the incident. In any case, although Congress disputed Barron's claims, his reports of the astronauts smelling smoke or fire are deemed factual on NASA's website. They identify Roger Chaffee as the astronaut who smelled fire. Other sources include books by Frank Borman and Peter Bond, and also the newspapers printed at the time. However, these sources log Chaffee's cries as being made at 6:31 p.m, the time the fire broke out, not 10 to 12 minutes earlier as Barron testified. These cries were absent in the communications available from spacecraft films. When this discrepancy was brought up in an online forum, Mark Gray of Spacecraft Films denied that these cries of smelling smoke or fire existed. Somehow, I don't trust him. As was evident in his Apollo 10 DVD set, Mark Gray likes to censor portions from existing NASA flight footage and then sell them to the consumer as uncut. This will become important a bit later. It seems we have two possible times for the first mention of fire. It was either at 6:31 p.m, as officially stated, or 10 to 12 minutes earlier, as reported by Barron. In the New York Times, it was reported that Grissom and White had managed to get their seatbelts off. Reduced to skeletons, their suits were found welded together by the fire. But months later, during the testimony of George Mueller, it was stated that none of the three astronauts had been able to unbuckle their seatbelts. Unbuckling their straps was the first procedure to open the hatch and escape. So my question is, would the astronauts have had time to unbuckle in a mere 15 seconds? I emailed Walter Cunningham of Apollo 7 to ask, as he served as backup pilot to Roger Chaffee on Apollo 1, but my message was never answered. Remember too, the untested hatch they put on the spacecraft needed 5 minutes to get open. Knowing that the door could only be opened from the outside, and that Barron claims the astronauts smelled smoke at around 6:20 p.m, where were the pad technicians when Grissom and his crew needed them most? When asked by Congress, was there any procedure in case the occupants in the capsule were incapacitated that somebody outside could take emergency procedure to get them out, Frank Borman replied, "Yes, sir, but since this test was not classified as hazardous, that team was not on duty." But earlier in his testimony, Frank Borman admitted,
"We are very aware of the fires at Johnsville Navy Air Station and also at Brooks Air Force Base."
How could NASA possibly have not considered this test hazardous when they were very aware of these past oxygen fires and knew the hatch was too unsafe? As with any rocket launch, the site had been wired with cameras. The day after the fire, the New York Times reported that the accident had been recorded by the pad cameras and seen on many television monitors.
Fires on spacecraft captured on film by Martin Waldron, special to the New York Times. Houston, January 27th. The flash fire that killed 3 astronauts in a spacecraft at Cape Kennedy tonight was filmed, an official of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration said today. However, the film and recordings made of the astronauts' voices, which were being monitored at Cape Kennedy and at Houston during the test, were sealed immediately after the accident. Paul P. Haney, Director of Public Affairs for the Manned Spacecraft Center here, said the film and recordings would be turned over to a board of inquiry of finding out exactly what happened.
According to the authors of Journey to Tranquility,
automatic television cameras outside focused on the hatch window to monitor the emergency escape practice at the end of the test, showed movements inside the spacecraft, which could have been White reaching up in a final effort to open the hatch. Then the flames swept across the window.